We are in the BI Platform studio, and I'm speaking with Alec Sharp, internationally acclaimed consultant and instructor in the area of the data modeling. Alec, you had a session during our conference on the human side of data modeling. Can you explain why the human side of data modeling is so important? I mean, what goes wrong when we take an overly formal or technocratic approach to data modeling?
Okay, that's a great question to start with, Werner. Thanks for having me here. To answer, it might be stating the obvious, but we are humans, and we humans like interactions, for the most part, that flow naturally. We don't begin a conversation with the rules of conversation. And we probably shouldn't begin our data modeling or concept modeling exercises the same way, by imposing a lot of rules on our business partners, which is not to say that I never tried that. Early in my career, I did try to teach business people data modeling before we did any actual modeling. And it went pretty well, but I did have one experience where a group of engineers really pushed back, and they said they were sick of people like me coming from IT and forcing my language on them. Why didn't, for once, I learn their language? And that really set me back on my heels. And I thought, gee, they're absolutely right. I should try to make this a very natural approach. And out of that was the approach formed that I follow, which is very language-based. We just begin with conversations about the business, me listening for the terms they use, and then carrying on from there. Now, this is not to say I do not have a structure. I very much do have a method I follow, but it doesn't look like it to the business people. It does seem a little more casual and natural.
Yeah, okay. And how can organizations ensure that the data modeling process is collaborative and inclusive, so that all relevant stakeholders are represented in this process?
Yeah, another good question. And I think first, before the organization ensures that it is collaborative, et cetera, they really have to believe that. We have to believe that this is inherently a collaborative activity, because we need the perspective of multiple stakeholders. As the saying goes, all of us are smarter than one of us. So we really need to take into account multiple perspectives. And the approach that I follow is very much the approach that I follow when I'm doing business process work. You know, as people who've attended my workshops, I like to point out that a process is horizontal and it cuts across the vertical functions or organizations of the enterprise. Data modeling is exactly the same thing. So I had a case recently where I was helping a company that builds financial products for the auto industry. They were looking at the process to develop an insurance product. And I began by saying, well, who needs to be around the table? And they identified the OEM team, the product team, the actuarial team, customer service, IT, and so on. And it would be exactly the same approach for building a product data model. Who are all of the functional areas that have a stake in this data? And then we want to identify individuals who possess the knowledge we need. And those are a mix typically of mid-level managers and supervisors and individual contributors. And if I can make one more point, I also always begin with one-on-one interviews, so people are more free to speak up.
Okay, well, you mentioned process and data. Business stakeholders often find it challenging to switch from a process-oriented into a data-oriented view. How would you address this challenge?
That is a good point. And I'd like to begin by pointing out that business people also have problems with that process perspective. When I do business process work, there are two challenges. One, people tend to think that their functional area is a process, a customer service process, a finance process, and so on, or they get confused by going into too much detail. So there's difficulties in the process world. So I don't begin by trying to lecture them about process, just as in the data world, when I'm doing concept modeling, I don't even want them to have a sense that they are shifting perspective. So I begin in the most natural way possible. I remember in one of the workshops we ran in Utrecht, Werner, somebody in the room said, always start on the other person's map. So start where they are comfortable. And again, that's why I take a language-based approach and also start looking at, let's say, what are the main activities that take up your time? And then we'll start to fashion that into a process-based approach. So very, very similar idea. Start where it is natural for that business person, which is talking about their business, using the language they use on a daily basis.
Okay. And how do you determine the level of detail that you require in your conceptual model?
Okay, that is a topic I have spent a lot of time on. I realized close to 20 years ago, when I was speaking at a DAMA International Symposium, people were throwing around the term concept model or conceptual data model, and they had radically different ideas. One person's conceptual model was my logical model. So I put a lot of work into looking at my beliefs, what had worked for me, and I ended up documenting it. And I'm going to share a slide in a moment. I did a presentation in London 15 or 20 years ago called The Lost Art of Conceptual Modeling. And in it, I tried to summarize what is the difference between these different kinds of models. So let me bring up a screen share. So this is, and there's probably more detail than we want right now. So the starting point is understanding that conceptual and logical or detailed models have different purposes for different audiences. Okay? And we can get very specific about all of those differences. Many-to-many relationships in a conceptual model, probably not in a logical model, and so on. I won't go all the way through this, but I built this specifically so I can build a good conceptual model in roughly 20% of the total modeling time. So I'm following the 80-20 rule. So we can describe the difference between conceptual and logical models. And I'll also point out one distinction I use is in a conceptual model, everything, whether you call it an entity, a business object, or a concept, everything is a term that business people use on a daily basis, not some hyper-detailed entity like seasonally adjusted price regional discount cutoff level. So we can define the difference.
Okay. And what are frequent mistakes made in conceptual data modeling? How would you address these mistakes or try to avoid it?
Okay, well, I think I would refer back to my answer to the previous question. So the answer is you have to begin by recognizing that conceptual and logical models, that's where there is the usual confusion. They are different types of models with different purposes. There are many more visual symbols, for instance, in a logical model than there are in a conceptual model. So I guess I would say the most common mistake that I see is when people from a technical background start modeling, They want to go too quickly into too much detail. They want to normalize too quickly. They want to resolve those many-to-many relationships. They want to push out those multi-valued attributes. They want to start specifying optionality, which really doesn't make sense in a conceptual model. They want to start capturing too many attributes, and whereas in my conceptual model, I do show attributes. I think it's a mistake when people say a conceptual model should not have any attributes. It should have a few for illustrative purposes. So mostly we have to, in terms of the content of the model, we have to be disciplined about knowing the difference between conceptual and logical. Avoid the urge to normalize, avoid the urge to get into, say, primary and foreign keys. And I would also say something I've spoken about very often is many people who are drawing these data models have no graphic design experience, but these are visual models. They have to follow certain graphic principles. Like, what do people infer from the position of an entity on a diagram? Well, as you probably know, I promote the idea that models should be drawn top down by dependency, because that's what naturally registers for human beings. So stay out of the weeds.
Okay, final question, Alec. How does data modeling fit in the broader context of data management and governance? Is this, for instance, where data ownership is determined?
I'll answer the last part first. No, I would not say we determine ownership while we are modeling, but I will say we can't do data management or data governance without models. I did a talk for the local DAMA chapter recently called The Surprising Resurgence of Concept Modeling. The subtitle was, "You Can't Manage What You Haven't Modeled." And that's true in all kinds of disciplines. We can't define organizational management without modeling the organization. We can't manage political authority without modeling, say, political jurisdictions. And data is the same thing. We have to have that map, that agreed on map. So when we say we're talking about the ownership of the product versus the customer versus the market subject area, we all know what that means. So once the modeling is done, then we can talk about ownership.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Alec, for the interview.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.